Have you ever been laughed at by someone who had no idea who you actually were? Marcus Delaney laughed. Not a nervous laugh, not an awkward one. A full, open-mouthed laugh, the kind a man gives when he's certain he's already won, when he thinks the person standing in front of him is too small to ever matter again. He laughed while two security guards each took one of my arms. He laughed while my access badge clattered onto the marble floor of the lobby I'd walked through for 11 years. And he laughed loudest of all when he said, loud enough for the entire open-plan floor to hear, "Some people just aren't built for where this company is going." I said nothing. I picked up my badge, set it gently on the security desk instead of leaving it on the floor, and I walked out through the revolving doors of Halloway Systems into the gray Chicago afternoon without a single word of protest. I had no idea, walking to my car that day with a cardboard box of 10 years of small belongings balanced against my hip, that in 14 months I would be sitting across a conference table from Marcus Delaney again. Except this time I wouldn't be the one who'd just been fired. I'd be the one who owned every desk, every badge, every laugh he'd ever get to have inside that building again. This is the story of the quietest, most patient revenge I've ever lived, and the exact moment Marcus Delaney realized that the woman he'd mocked out of a lobby had just become his boss. My name is Wren Callahan, and 11 years earlier, I'd walked into Halloway Systems as a 26-year-old junior data analyst with a state school degree, a stack of student loans, and absolutely no family connections in the tech industry to speak of. Halloway Systems back then was a mid-sized supply chain software company, maybe 200 employees, founded 15 years earlier by an engineer named Desmond Halloway who'd built the company on a single stubborn principle. The software should serve the people using it, not the shareholders watching it from a distance. I loved that principle. I built my entire career around it. Over 11 years, I moved from junior analyst to lead data strategist to, eventually, director of product analytics, a role I'd earned the hard way, through 80-hour weeks during the platform's disastrous 2019 outage, through 3 separate systems migrations that I'd personally saved from catastrophic data loss, through mentoring 11 different junior hires who'd gone on to build entire departments underneath the foundations I'd laid. Marcus Delaney arrived 4 years into my time there, hired as a mid-level account executive with an expensive suit, an Ivy League MBA, and the specific kind of charisma that made rooms lean toward him before he'd said anything worth leaning in for. He was good at his job in the narrow way certain people are good at jobs that reward charm over substance. He closed deals. He shook hands well. He remembered the names of clients' children, and used them at exactly the right moment in a negotiation. What Marcus was not good at, and what took the company nearly a decade to fully understand, was building anything that lasted. He built relationships that served him in the moment and abandoned them the instant they stopped being useful. He built numbers that looked impressive in quarterly reviews and fell apart the moment anyone checked the underlying retention data 18 months later. I know this because checking underlying data was, quite literally, my entire job. I had no idea, back in those early years watching Marcus climb the org chart 2 rungs at a time, that his particular talent for appearing successful while actually hollowing out everything he touched would eventually cost me the career I'd spent a decade building. The trouble started, as these things usually do, with the founder's exit. Desmond Halloway, the company's namesake and the man whose stubborn principle had shaped every decision I respected about the place, was diagnosed with early-onset Parkinson's when I was 7 years into my tenure. He fought through 2 more years of leading the company before finally, painfully, deciding to step back from day-to-day operations and hand the reins to a newly formed executive board. Marcus had spent those 2 years positioning himself with a precision I only fully appreciated in hindsight. He'd cultivated relationships with the 3 outside board members Desmond had brought in during the company's last funding round, private equity people who cared considerably more about quarterly growth curves than about the quiet, unglamorous work of building software that actually served small and mid-sized logistics companies who couldn't afford the bloated enterprise platforms everyone else was selling them. When Desmond finally stepped down as CEO, the board didn't choose from within the ranks of people who'd actually built the company's technology or its client relationships over years of unglamorous work. They chose Marcus, 34 years old, 4 years at the company, a talent for sounding exactly like what a boardroom wanted to hear. I remember the day of the announcement clearly, not because anything dramatic happened, but because of a single small moment that I didn't understand the weight of until much later. Marcus walked past my desk that afternoon, newly minted as CEO, and paused just long enough to say, "Wren, you've done good work here. We're going to modernize some things going forward. I hope you'll be part of that." I said I hope so too. I meant it. I had no idea that modernizing was about to become the word Marcus used to describe systematically dismantling every part of the company that had made it worth working for in the first place, including, eventually, me. The first 18 months of Marcus's leadership looked, from a distance, like genuine progress. Revenue climbed. New enterprise clients signed on, drawn by aggressive sales promises Marcus's team made about features that existed, at the time, mostly as roadmap slides. The board loved the growth curve. What the board didn't see, because Marcus made sure they never saw it, was the data underneath that curve, the data that lived in my department, the data that showed exactly how much of that growth was built on promises the engineering team couldn't actually deliver on the timelines Marcus had committed to. I brought this to him directly twice, in the careful professional language I'd learned to use in 11 years of navigating corporate hierarchies. The first time in a one-on-one meeting 8 months into his tenure, I showed him churn projections suggesting that nearly 40% of the new enterprise accounts his team had signed would likely leave within 18 months, once they discovered the promised features weren't materializing on schedule. Marcus listened, nodded, thanked me for my thoroughness, and did nothing. The second time, a year into his leadership, I brought the same warning to a broader leadership meeting, this time with concrete numbers showing 3 major clients had already filed formal complaints about missing functionality. Marcus's expression, across that conference table, shifted from mild irritation to something colder, something I recognized only later as the specific look of a man realizing that a subordinate's competence had become an inconvenience rather than an asset. "Wren has always been thorough," he said to the room, in a tone that made thorough sound somehow like a criticism. "But sometimes thoroughness slows down momentum. We need people who see where we're going, not just where we've been." I had no idea, sitting in that meeting watching my carefully documented warnings get reframed as a personality flaw, that Marcus had already begun quietly building the case that would end my career at Halloway Systems entirely. Over the following 6 months, the pattern accelerated in ways that felt, at the time, almost impossible to prove individually, but that formed an unmistakable shape when I finally looked back at all of it together. My department's budget was cut by 20% while sales and marketing budgets expanded. 2 of my strongest analysts were quietly reassigned to other departments under Marcus's direct oversight. My access to certain executive-level reporting dashboards I personally built the underlying architecture for, was mysteriously restricted for data governance reasons that were never fully explained. I started keeping my own records, not out of any grand strategic plan, just out of the same instinct that had made me good at my job for a decade, the instinct to document what I saw rather than trust that memory alone would be enough. I saved emails. I kept dated notes of every meeting where I'd raised concerns and every time those concerns had been dismissed. I had no idea at the time how much that simple habit was about to matter. The end came on a Tuesday in October, 16 months into Marcus's tenure as CEO. I'd been asked to present quarterly retention data to the full board, the same data I'd been quietly flagging for over a year. And this time the numbers were undeniable. Churn among the enterprise accounts signed under Marcus's aggressive growth push had hit 43%, almost exactly what I'd projected 14 months earlier. 3 of the company's 5 largest new clients had formally terminated their contracts in the past quarter alone, citing, in writing, unmet feature promises made during the sales process. I presented the data clearly, factually, without editorializing, exactly the way I'd been trained to present data for 11 years. I watched 3 board members exchange glances I couldn't fully read. I watched Marcus's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. 2 days later, I was called into a conference room by HR, not by Marcus, and informed that my position was being restructured as part of a broader organizational realignment. No specific performance issue was cited. No warning had preceded it. Just a folder, a severance offer, and a security escort waiting outside the door, because apparently even after 11 years, someone had decided I needed to be walked out like a liability rather than allowed to gather my own belongings with dignity. Marcus met me in the lobby on my way out, whether by coincidence or by design I never fully knew, and it was there, in front of nearly the entire open floor of employees who'd stopped their conversations to watch, that he laughed. I had no idea, standing in that lobby with security on either side of me in 11 years of my life in a cardboard box, that Marcus Delaney's laugh was about to become the single most expensive mistake of his professional life. I spent the first 2 weeks after being fired doing almost nothing, which was, for someone who had structured her entire adult identity around being useful and thorough, its own kind of quiet crisis. I slept too much. I reread the severance paperwork more times than was healthy, looking for some clause that might explain what had actually happened. I sat with the specific, disorienting grief of losing, not just a job but an entire decade's worth of identity built around a company I genuinely believed in. It was my former mentor at the company, a semi-retired engineer named Priya Okonkwo who'd left Halloway Systems 3 years earlier on good terms and had stayed loosely in touch, who finally called me 2.5 weeks after my firing and asked a question that changed the entire direction of what came next. "What are you actually angry about?" she asked, over coffee at a diner near my apartment. "Losing the job, or watching Marcus destroy something you spent a decade building?" I thought about it longer than I expected to. "The second one," I finally said. "I could find another job. I can't undo what he's doing to that company." Priya was quiet for a moment, stirring her coffee with the particular patience of someone who'd clearly been waiting to say what came next. "Then stop thinking like someone who got fired," she said. "Start thinking like someone who understands exactly how much that company is actually worth, and exactly how badly Marcus is currently mismanaging it." I hadn't considered it from that angle at all, not once, not in 2.5 weeks of grief and disorientation. But Priya was right about one thing I couldn't argue with. I understood the internal financial reality of Halloway Systems better than almost anyone alive, certainly better than Marcus did, because I'd spent a decade building the very data infrastructure that tracked exactly how healthy or unhealthy the company actually was underneath its curated boardroom presentations. I had no idea, at that diner table, that Priya's simple question was about to send me down a 14-month path toward becoming the exact person Marcus Delaney least expected to ever see again. I started, cautiously, by requesting a meeting with an old contact of mine, a woman named Odalise Ferreira who ran a boutique private equity fund specializing in acquiring undervalued mid-sized software companies before larger competitors noticed them. I'd met Odalise years earlier at an industry conference back when I still had a corporate email signature and a reason to attend industry conferences at all, and we'd stayed loosely connected through the kind of professional relationship that mostly exists as an occasional email exchange. I laid out, in careful data-driven detail, exactly what I knew about Halloway Systems' actual financial health versus its public presentation. The churn numbers, the engineering delivery gaps, the unsustainable sales promises, the specific documented pattern of a CEO prioritizing short-term growth optics over the long-term client relationships that had actually built the company's reputation over 15 years. Odalise listened to the entire presentation without interrupting, the way genuinely sharp investors listen, taking notes, occasionally asking a precise clarifying question that told me exactly how carefully she was tracking every detail. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and asked the question I'd been half dreading and half hoping for. "What's the actual acquisition case here, Wren? Not the emotional one. The financial one." I'd already built it, months of quiet, careful modeling done at my kitchen table using publicly available filings, industry benchmarks, and my own deep institutional knowledge of exactly where the bodies were buried inside Halloway's operations. The financial case was, in fact, remarkably strong. The company's core technology remained genuinely excellent, built on Desmond Halloway's original engineering principles that Marcus hadn't yet managed to fully corrupt. The client base, minus the churning enterprise accounts Marcus had recklessly oversold, remained loyal and profitable. The stock price, quietly depressed by 2 consecutive quarters of missed growth targets that the board hadn't yet publicly acknowledged as a pattern, sat well below what the underlying technology and remaining client relationships actually justified. "The company is undervalued because the market doesn't yet know what I know," I told Odalise. "Marcus is going to keep making the same mistake for at least another 2 quarters before the board finally admits there's a pattern instead of a blip. That's the window." Odalise smiled, the particular smile of an investor who just heard something she could actually build a strategy around. "Then let's build the acquisition case properly," she said. "And Wren, I want you leading the operational due diligence. Nobody alive knows this company's actual internals better than you do." I had no idea, walking out of that meeting, that I'd just taken the first concrete step toward standing in a boardroom 14 months later, watching Marcus Delaney's face drain of every ounce of color he had. The following 10 months were the most focused, most quietly relentless work of my entire career. Work I did almost entirely without anyone at Halloway Systems ever suspecting it was happening. I helped Odalis's fund build a comprehensive acquisition model, drawing on my institutional knowledge to identify exactly which client relationships were salvageable, and which enterprise accounts Marcus's promises had already permanently poisoned. I connected Odalis with 2 former Halloway engineers I trusted, both of whom had left the company frustrated by the same pattern I'd been documenting, and both of whom confirmed independently the exact shape of the engineering delivery gaps I'd flagged. Meanwhile, at Halloway Systems, exactly as I projected, the pattern I'd warned the board about accelerated rather than corrected. 2 more major enterprise clients terminated contracts in the following 2 quarters. A high-profile product launch rushed to meet a timeline Marcus had promised the board rather than one the engineering team had actually signed off on, launched with enough bugs that it generated genuinely damaging press coverage in 2 trade publications. The stock, already depressed, slid further. 2 of the 3 outside board members who'd originally championed Marcus's promotion began, according to industry gossip I heard secondhand through my old contacts, quietly expressing doubts in private conversations they thought weren't being noticed. I had no idea, watching this unfold from the outside with a strange, complicated mixture of vindication and genuine sadness for what was happening to a company I'd once loved, that the board's growing doubt was about to become the exact opening Odalis's fund needed. The formal acquisition approach began 8 months after that first diner conversation with Priya. Odalis's fund submitted an unsolicited offer to Halloway Systems board, a fair, well-researched valuation built on the company's genuine underlying strength rather than its currently depressed stock price, accompanied by a detailed operational assessment, one that I had in significant part authored, though my name never appeared on any public-facing document Marcus would ever see. The board's response, as I'd anticipated based on months of tracking their growing frustration, was cautiously receptive. Marcus, according to reports that reached me through my network of former colleagues who'd remained quietly loyal to me even after my firing, fought the acquisition aggressively in private board discussions, arguing that the company simply needed more time for his growth strategy to fully materialize. But the numbers, my numbers, the same numbers I'd been presenting to that board for over a year before Marcus fired me, had finally undeniably caught up with his promises. The board voted 6 months after the initial offer to accept the acquisition, subject to the standard due diligence period that would ultimately place me in an outcome I'd worked toward for nearly a year but still found almost surreal when it actually arrived, directly inside Halloway Systems offices as the fund's lead operational advisor overseeing the transition. I had no idea, the morning I walked back through those revolving doors for the first time in 14 months, carrying not a cardboard box but a leather portfolio bearing Odalis's fund's logo, that Marcus Delaney was about to experience the exact reversal he'd never once considered possible. The morning of the formal transition announcement, the exact reversal he'd never once considered possible. The morning of the formal transition announcement, I arrived at Halloway Systems offices 40 minutes before the scheduled all-hands meeting, walking through the same revolving doors, past the same marble lobby floor where my access badge had once clattered under Marcus's laughter. Nurse Patel wasn't there to hug me this time, because this wasn't a hospital and I'd never worked with anyone by that name, but 3 former colleagues who'd stayed at Halloway through the entire chaos of Marcus's tenure spotted me from across the lobby, and I watched their expressions shift from confusion to something like disbelief as they clocked the visitor badge in my hand and the fund's logo on my portfolio. Wren? One of them, a data engineer named Farid who'd worked directly under me for 6 years before my firing, said quietly, "What's happening right now?" "You're about to find out," I told him, and I meant it as gently as I could manage, because whatever satisfaction I felt about what was coming, I never once wanted it to come at the expense of people like Farid who genuinely deserved better leadership than they'd gotten for the past 16 months. The all-hands meeting was called for 10 o'clock, ostensibly to announce an exciting new chapter for Halloway Systems, language crafted by the board's communications team to soften what everyone in that room was about to learn was, functionally, an acquisition triggered by the sitting CEO's failures. I sat near the back of the main conference room, deliberately unremarkable in a plain gray blazer, watching Marcus take his position at the front of the room with the same easy confidence he'd carried for 16 months, apparently still unaware, even that morning, of exactly whose fund had made the winning offer. Odalise had insisted, during our planning for that day, that I be the one to formally introduce myself to Marcus in the room, rather than doing it privately beforehand. He humiliated you publicly, she'd said. The correction happens publicly too. Not for cruelty. For the record. So there's never any ambiguity about what actually happened here. I understood exactly what she meant, and I'd spent considerable time in the weeks leading up to that meeting making sure my own intentions stayed clean, stayed focused on correction rather than cruelty, in the same way I imagine anyone who's ever been deeply wronged has to consciously choose, again and again, what kind of person they want to be on the other side of vindication. Mr. Ellison, in this case Halloway's board chair, a measured, silver-haired man named Desmond's old business partner Aldous Whitcomb, stood at the front of the room and began the announcement everyone had gathered to hear. As many of you are aware, he said, Halloway Systems has entered into an acquisition agreement that will bring new operational leadership and renewed strategic focus to the company going forward. Marcus, standing near the front, nodded along with the practiced, confident expression of a CEO who genuinely believed, even in that moment, that he'd be positioned favorably in whatever came next. He had no idea, none at all, that Aldous's next sentence was about to end that illusion completely. The acquiring fund has asked that their lead operational advisor, who will be overseeing the transition period directly alongside our existing teams, introduce herself to all of you this morning. I stood up from my seat near the back of the room, and I watched in real time the exact moment recognition crossed Marcus Delaney's face. I watched his easy practice confidence falter, then crack, then collapse entirely into something that looked, for the first time in the 16 months I'd known him as CEO, like genuine unguarded fear. Good morning, I said, walking to the front of the room with a steadiness I'd rehearsed more times than I'd admit to anyone. My name is Wren Callahan. Some of you know me already. I spent 11 years here as Director of Product Analytics, until 16 months ago, when I was let go as part of what was described to me at the time as an organizational realignment. The room had gone completely, absolutely silent. Farid, near the middle of the room, had both hands pressed over his mouth. I watched Marcus's throat move as he swallowed, his eyes fixed on me with an expression I can only describe as a man watching his entire understanding of the world quietly rearrange itself in real time. I'll be serving as the lead operational advisor overseeing this transition on behalf of the acquiring fund. I continued, my voice steady, deliberately calm, deliberately free of the triumph I could feel humming underneath every word. Over the coming weeks, I'll be working closely with department leads across the organization to assess current operations and identify the path forward that best serves this company's clients, its technology, and its people. Marcus finally found his voice, though it came out considerably less steady than the voice I remembered from that lobby 16 months earlier. Wren, I think there's been some kind of mistake. You can't possibly be in a position to. There's no mistake, Marcus, I said, and I let just enough quiet weight settle into his name to make clear, without needing to say another word about it, that I remembered exactly what he'd said in that lobby, exactly how he'd laughed, exactly how certain he'd been that I would never matter to this company again. The fund's acquisition was finalized last week. I've been part of the operational due diligence team for nearly a year. I understand this company's actual financial health, its actual client relationships, and its actual engineering capacity in more detail than anyone else in this room, including, respectfully, you. Aldous Whitcomb, standing beside me, cleared his throat gently. Given the scope of the transition, the board has also determined that current executive leadership will be placed under formal review during the first 90 days of the acquisition process, effective immediately. I watched something in Marcus's face finally completely give way. Not the calculated frustration he'd shown in that earlier board meeting when I'd first presented the churn data. Not even the sharp, defensive anger I remembered from his private office confrontations. This was something rawer, something closer to a man realizing in real time, in front of nearly 200 of his own employees, that every promise he'd made about his own indispensability had just evaporated in the space of a single sentence. He didn't laugh this time. The 90-day review period that followed uncovered exactly what I'd expected it would, and in a few places considerably more than I'd expected. Marcus had, in the final 6 months of his tenure, quietly negotiated a personal advisory agreement with one of the enterprise clients his team had oversold, an arrangement that hadn't been disclosed to the board, and that created a direct conflict of interest between his personal financial incentives and the company's actual client relationships. 2 of his senior sales hires had been systematically inflating pipeline projections to meet the aggressive quarterly targets Marcus had set, a pattern that, once properly investigated, explained significant portions of the churn I'd originally flagged over a year earlier. None of it, in the end, rose to outright criminal fraud, the same way Marcus's situation never quite did in the story I once heard about a different hospital and a different fired employee. Real accountability, I'd learned by then, rarely arrives as dramatically as fiction makes it feel. It arrives instead as a slow accumulation of documented failures, each one individually explainable, together forming a pattern too consistent to keep defending. The board terminated Marcus's employment 31 days into the review period, this time with full documentation, full process, and notably, no security escort walking him past a lobby full of witnesses. I want to be honest about the fact that some small human part of me had once imagined wanting exactly that symmetry, wanting him walked out the way I'd been walked out, badge clattering, humiliation complete. When the moment actually arrived, I found I didn't want it at all. I'd learned, somewhere in those 14 months of careful, patient work, that the version of justice worth having wasn't the version that mirrored cruelty. It was the version that simply, finally, told the truth in a room where the truth could no longer be dismissed. Marcus left quietly, through a side entrance on a Thursday afternoon, and I never saw him again in person. The months that followed the leadership transition were, in many ways, the most meaningful work of my career. I stayed on with the fund's blessing not merely as an outside advisor but, eventually, as Halloway Systems' newly appointed chief operating officer, a role the reconstituted board offered me unanimously 3 months into the transition, once it became clear how thoroughly I understood the operational reality of a company I'd once been told wasn't ready for my thoroughness. I rebuilt the department Marcus had gutted, bringing back 2 of the analysts who'd been reassigned away from me and hiring 3 new team members who shared the same instinct for rigorous, unglamorous truth-telling that had once been treated as a liability under his leadership. I restored the client relationship review process Marcus had stripped down to speed up sales cycles, rebuilding the honest, sustainable growth model Desmond Halloway had originally built the company around 15 years earlier, before either Marcus or I had ever walked through its doors. I reached out personally to Desmond Halloway himself, now retired and managing his Parkinson's from a quiet house outside the city, to let him know, in a long letter I spent considerable time writing, exactly what had happened to the company in the years since he'd stepped back, and exactly what I intended to rebuild it into going forward. He wrote back 4 sentences that I've kept since in the top drawer of my desk. He said the company had always been less about him than about the principle that had built it. He said he was glad someone had finally remembered that principle before it was too late. He said thank you, and he said he hoped, whenever I felt ready, I'd come visit so he could shake the hand of the person who'd actually protected what he'd spent 15 years building. I visited him 3 weeks later. We talked for 2 hours about supply chains and stubborn engineering principles and the particular loneliness of caring more about something than the people around you seem to. It remains one of the best afternoons of my professional life. A year after the acquisition closed, Halloway Systems posted its strongest quarterly retention numbers in company history. Client churn, the exact metric I'd once been dismissed for caring too much about, had dropped to its lowest rate in 5 years. 2 of the enterprise clients who'd left during Marcus's tenure, once they heard through industry channels about the leadership change, reached back out to explore returning, an outcome I found quietly, deeply satisfying in a way that had nothing to do with Marcus at all and everything to do with the specific, patient work of earning trust back one honest conversation at a time. I created, within my first year as COO, something I called the Client Reality Council, a standing cross-departmental group made up of support staff, engineers, and account managers whose entire purpose was making sure that whatever promises the sales team made to prospective clients were promises engineering could actually deliver on realistic timelines. Some senior leadership at first found it slow, cumbersome, and unnecessary check on the kind of aggressive growth culture Marcus had once cultivated. I told them more than once that a company should slow down before it breaks its promises to the people who trusted it. Nobody argued with me twice. I didn't return to my old cubicle, the same modest desk I'd occupied for a decade before Marcus's promotion changed everything. I could have claimed a grander office on a higher floor, the kind that had once belonged to Marcus himself, all glass walls and skyline views. Instead, I chose an office adjacent to the client support floor, Close enough that I could hear most days the actual conversations happening between our team and the actual businesses depending on our software to keep their operations running. If leadership couldn't hear the floor, I decided somewhere in those 14 months of quiet planning, leadership had already started losing the thing worth protecting. 8 months after the leadership transition, I received a single brief email from an address I didn't recognize at first. It was from Marcus. 2 sentences, nothing more. He said he'd heard about the retention numbers and that the company looked like it was in better hands than his. He said he was sorry for the lobby. I read it twice, the way I imagine anyone reads the first genuine acknowledgement they've ever received from someone who once treated their competence as a joke worth laughing at in public. I didn't reply immediately. When I finally did, weeks later, I kept it simple. I told him I hoped he found work somewhere that valued patience as much as it valued charm, because eventually every company learns the difference, usually at the exact moment it can least afford to. I never heard from him again after that, and I found somewhat to my own surprise that I didn't need to. Whatever weight his laughter had once carried in that lobby had long since transferred itself into something else entirely, into the client reality council meeting down the hall, into Farid's promotion to senior engineering lead, into the quiet, unglamorous, deeply satisfying work of building something that would actually last. 2 years after I walked out of Halloway Systems carrying a cardboard box and 11 years of quiet devotion, I walked back through that same lobby on the morning of the company's 15th anniversary celebration, an event the board had specifically asked me to help organize, given how much of the company's original founding principle I'd fought to restore. The marble floor was the same. The glass ceiling above the lobby caught the same gray Chicago light it always had. But the room itself felt entirely different now, not because anything about the physical space had changed, but because I no longer walked through it wondering whether my thoroughness would someday become the excuse someone used to discard me. Desmond Halloway attended that anniversary celebration in a wheelchair, his hands trembling slightly from the Parkinson's, his eyes sharp and clear and unmistakably proud as he watched current employees, people who'd never even met him, describe the company's renewed commitment to the exact principle he'd built it on 15 years earlier. He asked me quietly, near the end of the evening, whether I ever thought about the day Marcus fired me. Sometimes, I told him honestly, not with anger anymore. Just as the day I stopped waiting for someone else to recognize what I was worth, and started proving it myself. He nodded slowly, the way I imagine my own father might have, if I'd had one who'd built something worth protecting the way Desmond had. That's the only kind of proof that ever actually lasts, he said. I think about that lobby often now, not the humiliation of it, but the specific, quiet lesson buried inside that humiliation, the one I only fully understood many months later. Marcus laughed because he genuinely believed that power was something you performed loudly, something you demonstrated through who you could publicly discard and how visibly you could discard them. He never understood that real power is almost always quiet. It's patient. It spends 14 months building a case instead of one afternoon building a scene. It walks back through the revolving doors not to gloat, but to rebuild what someone else was careless enough to nearly destroy. If this story resonated with you, hit that like button and let me know in the comments. Do you think Wren was right to bring the news to Marcus publicly, the same way he'd once humiliated her? Or would you have handled that final confrontation differently? Subscribe and turn on notifications because next week we're telling the story of a contractor who was fired for refusing to cut corners on a building safety inspection, and the exact building inspection 3 years later, that brought the entire company that fired him to its knees.